So thank you everyone for joining us at PhillyPoSH. We're really glad to have Stephen Murawski, PowerShell MVP, with us tonight to talk about desired state configuration. Steve works for Chef Software, previously Stack Overflow, Stack Exchange. Where were you before that?
A company called EdgeNet.
EdgeNet, okay. So very accomplished, very kind of like one of the pioneers of DSC, I think, if you will. So we're really glad to have him share with us DSC Resources. And we're also very pleased, in addition to Steve, we're lucky to have Teresa Wilson with us tonight, the scripting wife. So please see Teresa for free hugs at the at your earliest convenience.
My name is Steve Murawski. I work for Chef Software. As of the beginning of the year, I am now actually a software developer, though my pretty much all of my previous experience has been in the systems administration and mainly infrastructure, back-end type space. Now I get to build software for sysadmins and operations personnel. And I've been fortunate enough to have been awarded the Microsoft MVP Award for the past few years, primarily due to a lot of my work actually throwing beta software into production and dealing with all the pain there. So and that's where I got into desired state configuration. When I was at Stack Exchange, I rolled out DSC when it first came out and shipped right after the Tech Ed where it was announced. And shortly thereafter, I started putting it into production and kind of battled with it since and watched how it's kept improving. And hopefully what we'll get to talk about today will kind of spark some ideas, interest, and give you some direction. I'm going to talk specifically about resources today, but if you have questions in any area of DSC, configuration management, definitely bring them up. Bring them up as you hit them. I'd much rather address a question that you have at that time rather than leave you wondering till the end. So please do interrupt with questions. For the recording, I'll try to remember to repeat them. So, and for the people who are watching online. So, enough about me. Just a quick little refresher on desired state configuration. There's a couple of key components. There's local configuration manager. That's the agent that orchestrates everything and says, hey, what am I supposed to make my server look like? What am I supposed to check it out? What am I supposed to check? That's really just the agent that does things on a particular time schedule, and for the most part, ends up just shelling out to PowerShell to do stuff. Then there's then another component of desired state configuration is this domain-specific language, this DSL, for describing how we want our systems to look. Now, if you've used PowerShell for any length of time, you know it's very much this concept of think, type, get. I want to get the files in the file system. I'm going to get child item. I want to retrieve users from Active Directory, get 80 user. I want to change properties on a virtual machine, set VM CPU count, or whatever I'm trying to do. It's very action-oriented. Desired state configuration is very much not action-oriented. So we've got some language extensions and that gives us a way to use PowerShell syntax to describe the end state of how we want our systems to look. And so rather than describing how we get there, we describe what we want it to be. Now, there's lots of procedural PowerShell behind the scenes, and that's in the resources, and that's what we're going to dig into today. But the domain-specific language for creating configuration documents looks like PowerShell, but instead of being very imperative of how do I do this? It's what do I want to have happen? What do I want it to look like in the end? Then there's a REST server, a REST-based pull server. You could also use a file share. And a compliance endpoint in WMF4, Windows Management Framework 4. PowerShell version 5, Windows Management Framework 5, is adding in a reporting endpoint. Some of that stuff is still in flux. And we're going to talk we're going to talk a little bit more about what impact Windows Management Framework 5 has in the whole DSC space a little bit later. We're going to start out talking about the very basic stuff with version 4, and because there's still a lot of that out there. But version 5, they're changing up the game a little, and so there's some interesting stuff happening there. So why do you want to build resources? Why not wait for other people to build them, product teams to ship them? Because you guys know what your infrastructure needs. And you know what? There's a bunch of resources out there. The PowerShell team's been kicking out waves of resources. There's like 100 or some odd experimental resources. They're experimental for a reason. It's because no one's providing support behind them, right? So you know what you need to do to run your environment, and you're the one whose head it's going to fall on if things aren't working. And you're going to be the one that's responsible for getting things right. So you need to be, if you're going to run DSC in your environment, you need to know how resources work and how to make them work for you in your environment if you need to. Now, you do get these, you have these 100 and some odd resources out there from the PowerShell team. The PowerShell.org community has a handful of resources out on GitHub, and so there's these shareable artifacts that we create, and they may work for you, they may not, but you need to be able to evaluate that for your environment. Resources themselves are the most basic unit of work that you have in desired state configuration. Just like the commandlet or the function in PowerShell is kind of your basic unit of work, the resource is that in desired state configuration. So you might say, hey, I could create a resource for Exchange. It's going to deploy my Exchange environment completely. That's not the route you want to take. You want to have a resource that models your database availability group configuration. You want to have resources that manage your various transport settings, or you want to have resources for if you're in Active Directory, maybe for your site connectors. You want to have resources down to a level of, I want to manage individual settings on this particular thing. And so they end up being very low-level components. There is a method to kind of, in PowerShell, commandlets are that low-level API, right? And how do we then kind of compose all those and make reusable functionality out of them? We build functions and put them in modules, or we build scripts. And so we've kind of composed all of those low-level units of work into something reusable that has more logic behind it. We can do the same thing in desired state configuration with resources in a composite configuration, where we kind of pre-group those lower-level resources and can parameterize them with what we want and maybe set some defaults that we're going to want for our environments. So there is a higher-level construct than the resources. So resources themselves, we want to be as low-level as we can stand. I could write a resource that's going to twiddle a bit in a file. That's probably a little too low-level. But a resource to manage your app pool settings, perfectly reasonable. And you see an example of that in the X Web Administration module. A resource to manage a page file, perfectly reasonable. A resource to manage all your computer settings, probably not. That's probably a little higher level than you want to be. The other reason that you don't want to make them too big is these things the resources themselves, they get tested every time a DSC configuration refreshes on your system, which is going to be every 15 or 30 minutes, maybe hour, whatever you set for your environment. Your systems are going to be doing some work in the background when you're running desired state configuration. Because the idea of this system is that you have this test and repair functionality, that someone in the background is then responsible for going out and saying, hey, Are we still in compliance? If not, I need to get us there. Yes?
So just a question with that. How does this deal with change windows? So it's great that it goes out there for some reason something has drifted, and then all of a sudden it decides to repair it, but it's at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, and part of that repair requires a reboot. Well, I've just rebooted production server A, and that's kind of caused this whole problem.
So there's a couple of answers to that. Number one, when I talk about that test repair running constantly in the background, that is one mode that desired state configuration can run in. That is the apply and autocorrect. And there's two other modes you can run. You can do apply and monitor, where it just logs to the event log and says, hey, or to the compliance endpoint and says, hey, I'm out of compliance now, and you need to fix me at some point. Or just apply once, where it just applies and it doesn't run again. Apply and autocorrect is where you're going to get your greatest bang for your buck out of desired state configuration. So that's my default. That's where I default to thinking people should think about desired state configuration. Now, so you can run it in a manner where you control when you want things to apply. And so that would be, hey, I have my change windows that I can work in. That's the only time I want this thing applying. The reboot side of things, you can tell DSC, hey, I don't want you to reboot my system, or I want to allow you to be able to reboot my system. That's a setting you can have on the local configuration manager. Now, my more snarky answer would be, why is your system out of compliance that in such a state that it needs a reboot to bring it back in? You've got some workflow and people problems going on that DSC isn't the problem. You have some other problems in your environment. And so I'd say it's not DSC's problem here. That it's correcting things and bringing things back into compliance because somebody took them out, or some other workflow brought them out. You have some other control that's missing in your environment. And then kind of ancillary to that is you need to be confident enough in your configurations and the resources themselves that you understand what if I change a configuration document, I know what effect that's going to have on my environment. I've tested that change. That's actually one of the key things I like about the Chef ecosystem is there's a very heavy value on testing. And at the upcoming PowerShell Summit, if you're not able to go to that, it's coming up in the middle of April. They're going to record all the sessions. I actually have a session on testing DSC resources and DSC configurations, and I'm going to go a lot more in-depth into that concept. But I believe you should have a lot of automated tests around your resources so you know what effect they have when things change, and then also on your configurations that you put together so that I know how, if I apply this configuration, this desired state, how it's going to impact my production environment. And I can be aware of that. The other thing is, there's an architecture issue. If I'm worried about a server rebooting, maybe I need 2 of those servers behind a load balancer. That doesn't always work. SQL Server is a notorious one for this here. I have always on availability groups. I have replication. I have these I have failover clustering. I have these high availability options, but they all have a downside. And most apps don't play well with it because, hey, SQL Server is highly available. I don't have to care about it in my application code. Yeah, until that failover clustering, until it fails over, but it takes 5 minutes for that SQL Server instance to come back online, and I'm throwing yellow screens of death on my ASP.NET app because my SQL connections are failing. So, from that standpoint, there's an overall hardiness of the application environment that you're in. That's part of this as well. This is something we dealt with a lot at Stack Exchange. There was a great fear about failing over the SQL Server instances because we would throw these yellow screens of death occasionally. And we were running on beefy hardware with SSDs. There were full copies of the database on each of the nodes. It was always on availability groups, and so with local storage on each of them. So there was no transition of LUNs on a SAN to slow things down. It was solely DNS name or DNS re-registering to point to a different IP. It was just getting that listener name over for that to come over. And it would happen in, 10, 15 seconds. But there was enough traffic against the site that in those 10, 15 seconds, we'd throw tons of exceptions. So the developers actually had to spend a lot of time hunting down every place that would throw that and make sure that that was wrapped in a resilient manner, that if I hit that, maybe I would switch to read-only mode for that particular query or something like that. So a lot of it comes down to application architecture as well. You have all these different considerations, and then from there you can determine, okay, hey, we've worked out a lot of this stuff. We're going to go apply and autocorrect. Or I have to work within these change windows. I'm going to do apply and monitor, and then I'm going to maybe set some notifications off those event log entries to let me know when, hey, in this next change window, I have to let this server reboot. So kind of a long-winded response, but that's a very important question. That's one that comes up a lot, and so I want to make sure we addressed it.
So would another way of dealing with that be, just probably completely simplistic, add two LCM configurations? So during whenever normal was, it was apply and monitor, or monitor mode, but then during the change window, apply autocorrect, and then once the change window is done, if that was on a scheduled time, go back to the monitor only and look for the monitor.
Yeah, you're coming up with a pretty high touch solution. You're gonna have that basic effect, right? You're gonna have that effect one way or another. You can twiddle the LCM. You can force push new configurations. There's a couple different ways that you can have that effect. But when it comes down to is, I'm only going to allow configuration. There's a number of technical ways to achieve it. That way works. That's a perfectly reasonable way to work it. It's just a matter of saying, okay, hey, during this time frame, we're going to allow configurations to change. And it's not as simple as going in and setting a setting and saying, hey, I want to allow settings to change during this window. You have to do some automation around it, whether it's SMA workflows or orchestrator or having a human pressing a button. There's a number of there's a number of options there, but the key is it's all scriptable, it's all automatable, so you are in control of what you need it to do. Yes?
What if the business requires you to make changes between? It's a business decision, not necessarily a quote-unquote people problem. Does that mean that you need to go to the business and kind of shift into that?
So I would say that business problem is still a people problem, but it's a people and an engineering problem. People default to having that kind of behavior because they've had problems like that in the past where my failovers aren't seamless or my load balancing isn't effective enough to allow me to drop a web server or app server out of rotation and bring it back. That we haven't had enough automation and controls around that people felt pain, and so therefore we build in these maintenance windows. And these maintenance windows, so a couple jobs ago, I worked for a company that did data services, and we had all these contractual maintenance windows. Now, one of the things that happened was we knew about these maintenance windows, sort of, but when development or when engineering was determining where to deploy something into production, they never considered those maintenance windows. So ops knew about these maintenance windows for different applications, but engineering kept saying, "Oh, hey, we got this cluster that works this web server cluster that works just the way we want. We're just going to deploy onto this one." And all of a sudden, now we have app A only can be rebooted or that can only be maintained on the third Wednesday of every month from 8 p.m. to midnight. App B can only be on Monday, on the first Monday of every month from 2 a.m. to 4 p.m. to 6 a.m. Those are conflicting maintenance schedules. They're on the same box. I can never do box maintenance that requires a reboot of that box. Because it's going to take me 2 hours to drain stop the thing. So I'll never be able to actually, because of this business constraint that wasn't evaluated in the technical environment, it can cause issues. You get to a point where you have some engineering in place where I don't care if nodes come in and out of rotation to manage OS things, and we've got enough testing in place to validate that what we're doing, the changes that we're making, aren't going to affect the application layer. Then you start, once you can show that, you have a little bit better case to go to the business and say, hey, we can do this maintenance and meet our uptime requirements and not take the apps down, and because a lot of those change windows can be scoped, talking about when we can push new versions of the application. Or can be scoped to when we greenlight new features. Because you can do something like dark launching, which is a term I think that came out of Facebook, but it's basically you use feature flags, and you can constantly deploy new versions of the app, but you just don't turn new stuff on. You get that new code out there, it's getting exercised, but it's not actually exposed to the users yet. And then you can turn on. A lot comes down to how those things are technically worded, but more progressive ones in a lot of the newer web app software as a service type shops, that's the type of stuff you're seeing there, and that's what gives them that agility and that ability to bring stuff out to the public faster. All right. So I mentioned composite configs. Composite configs are really just, they're the analog. We have PowerShell commandlets, and we have functions or scripts. Composite configs are basically the function or script compared to the DSC resource. They just provide us a way to kind of package up and reuse common bits without having to declare all the low-level stuff every single time. Like if I have if we have a set way we configure IIS for 15 different applications, I don't want to have to create DSC configurations for every single application that I've got copy-pasted all this stuff in. I'll create a composite config that sets up IIS the way I want it to. Or I might have the same basic setup for SQL Server where I want the same logging settings. I want the same operators configured. I want the same mail hosts set up. So I might have all that kind of common functionality bundled up into one composite config that I could share amongst multiple uses, because there can only be one effective configuration on a server at any point in time. There is one configuration document that represents that server at any point in time. So if you need to change that document, you are changing that document wholesale. It's not like I have, big caveat here, that is changing with version 5. There still is only one version there, but there's a little flexibility there. That means that everything that goes to represent that machine has to be assembled ahead of time before we build that. We have to bring that all together ahead of time. So if I have one team that's managing the base OS and one team that's managing the application layer, these guys got to get together on how we're going to get our DSC configurations put together to build one larger document before it gets shipped out to the node. So that might mean you actually might have to talk to other people in your organization. Yes?
So you say that there are two different resources here, the OS resource and the app resource, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And they all have to be put together, merged essentially.
Into one document.
One document. And when you say one document, literally is it one single file they have to edit? So he's the app guy, I'm the OS guy. We have to edit the same file. Not directly, but is that?
Yeah. So So what so DSC resources, you model them in that configuration DSL, that PowerShell DSL, that domain-specific language that allows us to describe the end state of our systems. That DSL creates a command. That command will generate a MOF document, which is how it serializes out. It basically creates this text file that has a representation of the configuration you've written in PowerShell. It has it in this. It has it in SIM, which is the Common Information Model, which is how, and the MOF document is how it can pass it to a WMI endpoint, because that's what DSC is. It's a WMI endpoint. It can take this document, and that's how it can marshal the parameters across to that WMI endpoint. So that one document that gets generated that applies to that server is the result of a configuration script. So somewhere before that final configuration script runs, you guys have to come together, operating system and application, or whatever the divisions of management are there.
You're right. I might set the time zone for the server as EST, but then the app he's deploying is, let's say, catered towards object time something, and then we have to, because he's probably overriding me or I'm overriding him.
Oh, actually, you guys try to set the same thing. It's going to cause an error to generate the config. It's not even going to go out. So you actually end up having to talk to people to coordinate. PowerShell version 5 introduces the concept of partial configurations. It lets you go one step further without talking to each other, but then if it blows up on the server, so instead of blowing up earlier in the process, which is my preference, I'm not a huge fan of partial configurations because it pushes off that conversation. One interesting thing that they do with partial configurations, though, is when you define that structure for the partial configurations, is you can say only these particular types of resources can be used for this configuration. So my app tier guys can only use the say X web administration and maybe our internal application resources, and they'll never use the time zone resource. So you can avoid some conflicts that way if you put those constraints in place. The problem with partial configurations is now instead of checking for those collisions at the time of generating that config, it's pushed down to the box. You still end up with one configuration document, except now the local configuration manager is assembling that one configuration document to apply, rather than you doing it ahead of time. So there is a slight change to the statement of one configuration per box, and you have to merge them before, but the net effect or the end effect is the same. There's one configuration that represents the state of that box. So it's not like I might have here's Monday's config, Tuesday's config, Wednesday's config. You could do that, but you're changing the configuration on that node daily then. All right, moving right along. So what do DSC resources actually consist of? All they are is a PowerShell module. Has 3 functions: get target resource, set target resource, and test target resource. All three functions have the exact same parameters. This module that you create for that resource exists inside another module. They're kind of a host module, if you will. And that module can actually have its own commands. It can have its own life outside of these DSC resources. But it lives in a folder called DSC Resources, and so it's this nested module, so that you don't have sitting on your PS module path like 15 different modules that all have the same commands. So that'd be annoying. If I had 15 different modules that all had get target resource, set target resource, and test target resource, it would cause some fun with module autoloading. But these DSC resources, they live inside a host module. Those functions are available Any functions that are in that host module are available inside the resource. Any got checks for everybody? And this is the structure that you'll see. So you got your basic module folder. So if I'm using X Web Administration as an example, the top level is X Web Administration. Then I have a folder called DSC Resources. And then maybe I have my XMSFT or MSFT X App Pool or Web App Pool, whatever the name is. And then I have a module metadata file, module file with my Get-TargetResource, Test-TargetResource, and Set-TargetResource functions. And then this fun document that everybody gets all nervous about, this resource module, the schema.moff. So in the case of my app pool one, it would be msft _ x app, web app pool.schema.moff. For the most part, you really don't have to care about that schema.moff. There are tools out there that will generate it. There's either the now I can't think of the module name. As part of the DSC resource kit, there's a module that has commands to help build DSC resource modules, and it will build out, as you add parameters, it will build out your schema.moff for you. Yeah, the DSC Resource Designer. That is it. And then in some of the tooling that we have on PowerShell.org's GitHub site, I have a tool out there that will take a look at your test target resource and set target resource functions and take a look at the parameters and generate a schema.moff from that for you. So you build your functions first, and you can generate a schema.moff from it. So for the most part, you really don't have to worry about that. We'll take a look at what one looks like. But you really don't have to concern yourself too much with them. They're not as big of a deal as you might think. So this structure back here is pretty important because this module has to have a module metadata folder. DSC resources are versioned, and they're versioned based on the version number of this host module. So I can have 0 or more DSC resources in a host module. So any module that you have can have DSC resources or not. All of the resources in that module share the version number of the module that it lives in. So my X Web App Pool has the version of X Web Administration. Same as X Website. Those are both in that web administration. Those are both resources in the web administration module. And so they share the X Web Administration module's version number. When you run that configuration script, when you generate a configuration for a machine, it stamps in the version number of the module that is available on that machine or that you've specified in your configuration document. There's an import DSC resource keyword. It's not a function, so don't go get command. You're not going to find it. It's a keyword in the context of configuration. So you can define which version you want, or it's going to pick up the one that's locally on the system. That version of a module has to be available on the target node, or the configuration won't run. If you have a pull server, it can try to get the right module if you have it available and packaged up for it. It can pull it from the pull server. That's one of the main points of the pull servers. You got one place to go for configurations and one place to go for resources. So it can always get the right one. But that means wherever you generate your configs, the versions of the module that are there that need to be available to be distributed to your nodes. If you're pushing configurations and you're not using a pull server, you're just using start DSC configuration to ship over a configuration to a node, it is your responsibility to make sure those modules are on that remote node. If you're in push, it won't go and grab them for you. I believe that's changing in WMF5. I don't think that's a stable thing yet. where you can do push and it will go to a pull server that can be just for modules and not configurations. So as you start building or working with desired state configuration resources, if you're sharing them out, versioning is a very important concept to get a handle on. If you're sharing versions around, there's semver.org talks about semantic versioning. PowerShell modules don't fully support semantic versioning, but they support some of the concepts are applicable. Like you have a major version, a minor version, and a patch version. Major versions get bumped when there's breaking changes. So if you have a breaking change to an interface, like you're changing a parameter name, that you want to bump a version number up. So you should be able to look at the version number and tell, hey, is this just like a bug fix thing that I can just swap in, or do I have to really look at what the changes are here? So, but not everything follows semantic versioning, though I wish it would. When we look at a configuration document, you'll see that module version stamped in the config, and in desired state configuration, as it stands today, there is no concept of allow any version greater than 1, for example. It's an equality. If I have version 1.2.3.7 on my box, that's what needs to be on the nodes that's being applied to, or at least on the pull server to be distributed there. So we've got in our resources, we have 3 functions. We have Get-TargetResource, Set-TargetResource, and Test-TargetResource. So how are they actually used? So when I apply a configuration to a node, the DSC engine gets this MOF document that's got a bunch of resources defined in it, and it takes a look and it starts to reconstitute them and says, oh, okay, here's your page file resource. It's telling me I need a page file with a 1 gig max size, 1 gig minimum size. I better create that. I better lock that file down. What do I need to do that? Well, first I need to check if it's already configured that way. So it uses Test-TargetResource with the values from your configuration. Those match the parameters on those functions. The functions that you have, Get-TargetResource, Set-TargetResource, and Test-TargetResource, those parameters match up to the values that you can fill in for your configuration. So let's take a look at just kind of an example of that. So I have, let's see.
Crazy question. You're running this on a Mac. Is there a DSC provider or consumer for Mac, or is it you'd have to use the Linux ones and try and shoehorn it in, or really and truly they don't touch and you just prefer using Mac?
So, good question. There's not a DSC provider for there's a Linux one. I don't know if it runs on a Mac or not. Mac is my work laptop, and that was a standard loadout at Chef. And I could have got a Windows box if I wanted to. I have other ones, but I wanted to feel the pain of cross-platform management because that's what some of my customers feel, and it is painful. So I actually do a lot of my development work. I have a little Gigabyte Bricks that runs Server 2012 R2. That's where I do most of my development work, and then I validate on the Mac a lot of the time to see how things work there. And also then it lets me compare our tools and say, hey, see how our tool works on the Mac? Why isn't it working the same way on Windows? And then I can go, try to lobby for some developer time to help me fix it. All right, X Web Administration, DSC Resources. Let's take a look at.
So when you were mentioning the resource name, the resource types there, something to be aware of, at least in the version 5 stuff, they also have some localization files, strings.
So yeah,
and that can cause an issue if they forget to put them in there when they publish them.
Yep. And it's not just the V5 stuff. V4 as well. If you don't have a fallback, so there's a pattern you can do, and let's see. So like, let's see. So and I'll blow this up a little here. So what I'm doing here, or what I do with this one here is, so I have localized help for the page file resource in one of the community modules, and check to see if there's the ENUS folder at least, and then we try to import localized data, because we actually have it localized, I think, to Dutch as well. But then if those folders somehow didn't make it, that data, it's available there in the module itself. Not everyone has done that. It's not been implemented consistently, but that's one pattern you can do to help avoid that localization. But that is a problem that can come in.
Yeah. Especially if they don't put the test path.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I bumped into that a time or two. So, all right, let's get back and take a look here. Yeah, there's some things I love about the Mac. Some things I really miss, like PowerShell, when I'm on here. But so in my function here, I have these 3 parameters I can take. When I define a resource when I define this resource in a DSC configuration script, these are the 3 values I can pass. I can pass a name, I can pass whether to ensure present or absent, I can pass a state. So those are my 3 options. There's a schema.map file then that maps these out to sim types so that WMI can marshal parameters between PowerShell and the WMI endpoint. That's the whole point of that schema.map file, is so that it knows how to pass parameters back and forth between WMI and PowerShell. Because the type systems between .NET and WMI are different. So it needs that mapping. So we have that. So local configuration manager gets this configuration document and starts to reconstitute these resources, passes the parameters to the test target resource to say, hey, are you in the state I expect you to be in? Test target resource's job is to validate that. And if it is in the correct state, it returns true. If it's not in the correct state, it returns false. If it returns false, then the local configuration manager says, okay, I need to try to fix this. So I pass the same parameters to set target resource. Set target resource has the job of fixing it, in whatever state it's in. Now, this is where these modules can be somewhat inconsistent, because you're relying on the module author to know how to get that system into the desired state from wherever it was before. Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes it takes a couple of times to get there, because maybe there's a reboot that needs to happen in between. Systems like desired state configuration are called eventual consistency. I might not get you there the first time, but I'm going to keep trying and keep banging away at it. And that's when it's an apply and autocorrect, that's the job. It keeps trying to fix it. And as long as it returns false, I'm going to keep trying to apply that set target resource. Now, if there's a bug in it, or if the system state is such that I can't get it there, you're just going to see errored runs, whether it's at your compliance endpoint, whether you're monitoring log file, event log files, whether you're watching this interactively. But you're going to see it error. It's going to stop an error out there. When a resource fails to apply, that's where the configuration stops. So, as long as it can repair, or at least try to repair, and that try doesn't error, it will continue on. If that try to repair. Now, there's a difference between I tried to repair it, I didn't, and it didn't error. I'll just continue on. My next cycle where I check, if I failed to get there, it will still test false, and so I'll try to do it again. So there are scenarios where you don't want to error because you don't want to stop. You just want to finish the next time around. So, I mean, but if it does hit this error condition, then it's going to say, okay, hey, I can't get past this. So depending on, and this is where it comes down to, what the module author or what the resource author has determined are actually blocking errors versus things that I can get through. I just need another time or two to run through it. So this test to repair process goes resource after resource, and then after that run's done, starts up again the next time around. Now this process is why I say you don't want your resources to be too broad, because this is going to run in the background if you're running apply and monitor, or if you're running apply and autocorrect. Every 15 minutes, every half hour, whatever your schedule is, there's going to be commands running on your system to do stuff. Whether it's just checking, whether it's actually applying. And that can have an impact on system resources. If I want to assert the state of every single file in the file system, my server is going to be useless. This is not tripwire where I'm monitoring things for, I'm monitoring every registry key for things to change. These are systems for positive assertions about what I need to get to the state I need to be in to run something. It's not the, this is the exact model of every single thing on my system. That's just not feasible. So, very often you'll hear this called idempotence, and then you'll have people who know math get mad at you because it's not really that, but that's the term that's been co-opted. I don't know math, so I'm not going to try to tell you where that's wrong. But test and repair is really what we're doing. And any of the systems out there, desired state configuration, Chef, Puppet, CF Engine, any of those types of systems, that's what they do. So, start talking about this a little bit. Test target resource, its job is to make sure that we are in the state that we expect to be in. If it returns true, then set target resource gets to take the day off. Set target resource gets us where we need to be. It has the responsibility of knowing how to go from an unknown state to the known desired state. That means set target resource is probably going to be more than just a couple of commands, unless you're calling some function that already has a whole lot of logic built in to figure out, hey, I'm here. How do I get to where I want to be? So, and then get target resource. We didn't talk about this one yet. It's of somewhat, I don't see a whole lot of use of it, but hey, it is supposed to get target resource is supposed to return what the current representation of that resource is, whether it's in the desired state or not, how that actually models out.
this ad hoc? To query a bunch of those to see what their current is?
You can use Get-TargetResource. It will only return details on resources that are already modeled in the configuration for that node. So you can't use Get-TargetResource or Get DSC configuration. It is the command that calls this behind the scenes. So you can't really use this to go and say, hey, reverse engineer the server for me. DSC does not do that. If you're looking for something like that, there's a tool called Guardrail from a company called ScriptRock. They have something kind of around that where you can, it doesn't do the whole server, but you can say, hey, here's things I care about in this box. Can you create a DSC configuration from that? And it can do some of that reverse engineering for you. It's not perfect, but it can get you a good starting place. And so, but they do more than that. They monitor, configuration drift. They can diff nodes. They got some real cool visualization for that. But
let's say my example was I only cared about the value of a particular registry key, and could I use Get-TargetResource to see what the value is on all 100 nodes? And I know.
Yeah. So
your change window what I would be changing.
Yeah, so you're not going to call Get-TargetResource directly. You're going to call Get DSC configuration, which is going to return a structured object that has all of the or return objects for all of the resources that are defined on that node. So you could go through and you could filter down to that. So you could say Get DSC resource, give it a list of servers, get all those back, filter down to what you're looking for. It's not as granular as saying, hey, get this particular resource from all these nodes. You're going to get the full configuration from those nodes, and then you'll filter down. But yes, you can definitely do that. Now, that is if people implemented Get-TargetResource correctly. Looking at a lot of the community resources, it is not done correctly in almost every case I've actually looked at. I'm sure I haven't looked at every case, but there are cases where they just feed back the parameters you gave to them, or they return an empty hash table. Or, there's a ton of just bad when it comes to Get-TargetResource, because it's not, Get DSC configuration is not like super high on the priority list for people to care about. Because I care about applying the configuration and testing if it's in the right state. The Get DSC configuration just hasn't been shown a lot of love.
So in principle, it's there, or maybe the future is to look at drift in environment. You apply a configuration for 100 nodes, as he says, and then you use this to have they all been applied, or what are the parameters? So, is that the whole configuration, but also to get a drift, a drift?
Yeah. So
is that the goal, or
you're going to get that back from the compliance anyway.
If
you've got these broken out, when you do your, hey, is this in compliance? It's going to tell you that information.
I think the idea of it was more along the lines to enable a different set of tools so that you could also because you don't have to return just the resource data. That you can actually include read-only properties in your schema that can be returned from Get-TargetResource, so that there are things that you can't supply as part of the configuration but that can be returned. I'm really not a fan of this, because now I'm turning DSC into more of an operations tool, and for ongoing operations, where this should be set it, forget it in the background, and then if something's going wrong, my event log monitoring or my compliance endpoint or whatever should be alerting me that, hey, something is out of whack.
The argument is almost I don't care.
Yeah.
The current state is, because when I implement or run my configuration, it's going to be what I told it to be.
Right, because if it's not, I should be being alerted of that in some other fashion, and I can either blow that machine away and reimage because I have my model of what that machine should look like, and my data is backed up, or it's on a different box, so I don't care. Or I can go and troubleshoot, whatever is appropriate for the system. And Get-TargetResource, Resource, or Get DSC configuration might be useful in that case. It's never been useful to me.
So you just mentioned something there about blowing away the machine.
Yep.
dealing in a production environment, we have certificates, we have stuff there. Are you, or have you seen one configuration per machine with unique certificates for encrypting of passwords, or one configuration for a role type and having to deal with, okay, fine, we have to push our public key or the private keys to that group of servers so they can decrypt the passwords, but that's the role for that server or that server role versus, hey, each individual server gets configured separately, even if they're all pulling the same configuration.
I've seen both. And
is this just one of these religious wars that you go through? And
it's how much you actually care about those specific things. It might be some of the compliance stuff your security requires you to have. If I can't have a key shared between a bunch of nodes, if I have a bunch of nodes that are all doing the same thing, and they're accessing the same set of data, is it such a big deal that they all share the same key? Maybe not. That comes down to less of a. It's more keys is a more of a management nightmare, more of a headache, because you have to store thumbprints for each of those with each node's data. It's more data I have to have per node versus per service that I'm providing or per application. But it's doable. I mean, it's all how much work you want to put into it, and it's all what your requirements are for your business.
Just thinking that if you've got the one config that's out there and you're using a single config, and you can't do any machine localization, any specific machine.
Oh, that's so.
Sorry, it was kind of a two-part base round.
No, so you can totally have one master configuration and have tons of local customization per node. So one of the whole ideas behind desired state configuration and a lot of these config management systems is how I set my servers up, and then the data around the environment that they're in are two different things. So the connection string I point to, that one app points to, one set of web servers point to for staging versus what production points to. That has nothing to do with how SQL Server is configured, for example, or how IIS is configured. That's just a value that gets plugged in based on what environment I live in. And so any of these systems, Chef, Puppet, DSC, there's a system for kind of separating that data out from the structural config. Like if you're embedding a connection string in a DSC resource, you're doing it wrong. And you might not know better, and I'm not mad at you if you've done it, but you're working too hard. You're duplicating too much. So that's what this concept of configuration data is for. So so we have this configuration DSL, and I'll show you a configuration script so we can actually put some context around this. These are very, very simple configurations. Let's look at one, and just demonstrates one node and one thing here. So any configuration. So I run this configuration. It creates a configuration command called set manual with system managed size, for example. Right. That command takes a parameter configuration data. Configuration data is a hash table, and I actually have an example I can show you of that hash table. From let's get to my demos for ChefConf. So here we go. So we have this configuration data concept. It's just a structured hash table. There's one common key called all nodes that's that is named a particular way and contains an array of hash tables. That structure is kind of defined. That's by convention. And the PowerShell team has reserved the right to add more keys prefixed with PS. Any other keys that end up in configuration data, you can do with that whatever you want with. And so that's where you're going to kind of build some of your service patterns around. But in all nodes, I have hash tables. They're going to have a node name, and if I'm using a pull server, they're going to have a GUID that identifies that individual server or that server's role. So basically, the local configuration manager, you're going to assign a GUID to it. And you can assign that GUID to one or more servers, depending on if you're going to do role, configuration by role or configuration by individual box. So that's where you can make that determination. And then in all nodes, you can stick in a bunch more data. So like, for example, for this node, I've added some extra data here saying, hey, there's a couple of websites I want you to stand up. The Clown's website on 80 and the Bear's website on 81, for example. All right? And then there's some other metadata here that stands outside of that, that's not specific to the node. Maybe I might have under a hierarchy like site or or environment. Might have production, and production will get one template, and I'll have a different template in staging, for example. So, and you can have your configuration look that up based on, hey, my node is, I'll label my node as production, and so it'll go look for production. Then you have to write some of that logic. If you want an example of that, in the DSC, in the PowerShell.org GitHub repository, there's a DSC configuration module, and there is a command in there called resolve DSC configuration, and there's some other commands around setting up some structure. That gives you an example of something where I built out a hierarchy for services and data centers, and it would actually, you just run this command and it would search up and down the tree of metadata and plug it in based on the node and figure out, oh, it's a web server, it's an Oregon data center, here's the values to give it, and it's supposed to run these websites, and so, but your configurations don't have to have that stuff embedded in it. It all sits in this configuration data that you can just shove in there separately. And so you can have the same structural config that you can reuse across environments, and you can you basically make your environment data-driven versus having to really kind of hard code and tie that stuff to it.
So all the app developer has, or we can say, hey, the configuration data can be managed by the app developers because they might change the endpoint.
Yep.
They just go put it on GitHub or whatever your own version control, and then, okay.
Yep. But you're not deploying one single moth, so you're not using the same GUID across all of those machines specifically.
So you can,
if they are exactly the same.
Right, if you want them to have the same configuration. Now, if I'm using the push model, the node name has to be the name or DNS name. However, my start DSC configuration is going to be able to look up and get a network address for that node because it's got to reach out, and when you're pushing it, it needs to be able to resolve and identify that. So if you're doing start DSC configuration and push, you're going to have one file per node. If you're doing pull, you can do by role. If you want to have that abstraction and not care about individual nodes.
So if you're doing it by pull, then the node name, if you've got the node defined there and later on you rename the file to the GUID, it will still find its computer resource in there, won't it?
So if you're doing pull, the node name has to be the GUID. If you're doing pull, the node name is the GUID because that is what the node name. So the pattern that you'll see in the DSC resources is this. For example, you'll see like all nodes that node name, or you'll see all nodes where, and there's be some filter and that node name. And there's actually node name is. It's not defined anywhere, but there is some magic around that node name. because you can do node name equals asterisk or wildcard and have that match. And the DSC configuration functions behind the scenes actually understand that. So there is a bit of magic around the node name key. So that node name needs to be a GUID if you're doing poll.
Is that changed in version 5?
No.
The reason why these questions is because in all my stuff, the full service, I've got the node name is the node name of the resource, of the eventual target, and then I have a function at the end which looks up AD, finds the file, renames the file to the GUID.
The DSC configuration, if you put the node name there, if you put that GUID there, it labels it correctly. You don't have to do that. So you're modifying it after.
I'm doing it after, so I create all my moths, and then I go through while I'm doing my checksum. I rename them, create a checksum in my target directory with the GUID.
Right.
Okay.
So what you could do is instead of just have a name. I stuck a name in there, and I used my server name in there, and then the node name was the GUID.
Okay.
So you're ending up with the same result, but you're just putting your node name in there and you're just doing more work.
Okay. Cool.
Which is okay, which is fine. I mean, you're getting the result, but in order for the pull server to work, the local configuration manager has that GUID assigned, and when it connects to the pull server, it asks for a configuration with that GUID.
Right.
And so it can't ask by server name, because server names in an Active Directory forest, you can have duplicate names based on depending on where they live in the directory structure. So the GUID is a way to disambiguate. It's also a way then you could instead of having to rely on server name, you could do the same role across a number of servers. Now you can only have one configuration for that particular GUID. So if you're doing your node name thing, and you decide to share a GUID across things, you're going to end up with file name collisions if you're doing individual server stuff, unless if you decide to do a shared GUID across. So, but all right, let's get back to PowerPoint. See where I left off. All right. So that was a little detour from Get-TargetResource. So the scheme, no, you guys have some awesome questions. No. You guys have some awesome questions. That's good stuff. So, I've worked with this stuff long enough that sometimes I forget some of the questions that I had initially, and so it's great when you ask them because then it's like, oh yeah, that's a really important concept to get across. But it's just now it's comfortable to me. So, all right, schema.moth. Yeah, this is that mapping. It's super important, but it's super forgettable because we have tools to generate it. So the only thing we really need to care about in the schema.moth is one particular thing. And there is, too many fingers. There is this. So when we have a schema.moth, we have this class name here. That is the name of the resource module. This friendly name is what we can use in our DSC configuration DSL, so we don't have to type this big long name. So this friendly name is probably the one thing that we'd have to edit in this document. The rest of this we don't necessarily have to care so much about. Thank you, Teresa. And so Super important, super forgettable. The only thing you should really remember is friendly name, because that's probably the only thing you'll have to edit here. If you are editing more in this document, you're probably working too hard. And so if you find yourself doing a lot of moth editing, step away, grab a cup of coffee, take a couple deep breaths, maybe ping out on Twitter, maybe ask in PowerShell IRC or something. Drop an email or drop a forum thread on PowerShell.org, because there's probably a better way around it, or a faster way or a more repeatable way around it than going and editing a bunch of schema.moth files. All right, so let's see here. So something that's very important to consider when you're looking at DSC resources, or when you're writing them, when you're editing them, when you're working with them, is you have to be extremely aggressive on the error handling. When the local configuration manager is running in pull mode, non-terminating errors are terminating. When you're running in push mode, it doesn't seem to be the case. So, not quite sure why the discrepancy there. I've not gotten a real answer on that. But because these things aren't running interactively, they're running in another process on another machine, and WMF5 has some stuff that's going to help us with this. But use lots and lots of write verbose and write debug statements so you can trace what's going on inside your resources. There is no penalty for this. And then, because a lot of this stuff will end up in the analytic and debug logs for the DSC operational log. There's the operational, and then there's analytic and debug. So if you need to figure out what's going wrong in your DSC configurations and in the resource application, lots and lots of verbose logging will definitely be your friend. It will save you many, many hours of frustration and pain, and probably save me a few gray hairs if I would have had more to begin with. Yes, the other thing is, making sure a lot of the common error scenarios, like if you try to retrieve a file that doesn't exist, or like resolve path against a file that doesn't exist throws a non-terminating error. In the context of DSC, that's going to terminate if you're in the pull mode. You don't necessarily think that that's going to be a big deal because, hey, when I run interactively, it just keeps moving right along. I get something on the error stream, and hey, everything's fine. Error action preference, silently continue. Hey, I don't care. No, but you want to make sure that you handle either capturing errors with error action preferences, or try catches, turning things to terminating errors and try catch them. But you want to make sure that the only errors that are going to crop up and stop are errors that should stop things. Now, the only way you get to figure that out is lots of testing.
So if my resource throws an unhandled exception, it's like full stop, right?
Yep.
LCM just blows up.
Yep, you'll get three errors in the operational event log, all basically saying, hey, things blew up, here's your error message.
But then after whatever the configured time for the LCM, it's going to come around and do a test again.
And
start all over, right?
And start all over until it hits that error. Yep. Now, if that error condition resolved itself in that time, you'll be fine. That's that eventual consistency model of, hey, maybe there was a timing issue, or maybe there was a reboot in the middle that needed to happen. So maybe I threw those errors, but the next time I picked up and started running, everything was good. Now I don't care. But if I keep hitting it and keep throwing these errors, that's something I need to go look at. So outside of the concept of desired state configuration, if you are not doing something for centralized event logging, that is something you should be looking at doing. Whether it's Windows Event Log Forwarding, take a look at the PowerShell Summit EU's videos. Lee Holmes did a talk, and one of the areas he covered was event log forwarding, and he referenced some of the stuff that Microsoft does around that and how well it scales. I had some really rough times with event log forwarding when it first came out, but I guess it's really, really good now. Or if you're not doing something like Splunk or Logstash and Kibana and Elasticsearch, some kind of whatever it is, some kind of central event log, SCOM, something that's watching your event logs in a central place. That is definitely something you'll want to do that will make your lives a lot easier as you try to scale out with desired state configuration. And when I say scale out, I don't necessarily mean to hundreds of thousands of machines. I mean I want my infrastructure to manage itself. I manage these text files or script files, and I get to go do other interesting stuff. So you're scaling yourselves, not necessarily, because one common misconception is that this config management stuff is only for like the Facebooks and the Etsy's and these like super scale environments where I've got hundreds and hundreds of servers floating around, or thousands of servers floating around. That's not necessarily the case. Config management is even, I think, even more important in the small and medium business space, because there's so much more work being put upon you versus those environments where they can have dedicated people for these individual things. So, yes?
So you mentioned here debugging and the fact that you get the difference whether you run unattended or attended as such. So rather than going away, getting a cup of coffee, talking to the people around the cooler for 28 minutes to get back to watch an event log, is there a way, while you are debugging these resources, to actually force it to run, but it's not, hey, I want to watch you in interactive mode, but damn it, I don't want to wait another 29 and a half minutes just to figure out whether or not I fixed what I screwed up last half hour.
Yes. So there are commands in WMF5 for it, and in WMF4, in the tooling modules on GitHub from PowerShell.org, there is one of the commands in I think the DSC operations module is invoke DSC pull or something like that, something to that effect, and that will poke the local configuration manager to do another consistency check.
Is that the WMI setting the flags through the one?
Yep. Yep.
So going back to that, so if I have a resource that throws an unhandled terminating exception on the set and blows up, and then the rest of my config stops processing at that point, right?
Yep.
But the config is basically, the DSL is translating that to a mop. Is that mop in the same order as what's in my configuration?
All right, so order in your configuration. Right now, DSC is still kind of single-threaded. So the order in which you've written stuff, it tends to be the order in which it executes. Now, if your configuration DSL, right, is PowerShell. So you can write flow control. You can include composite config. So the end result of that mop document might be a little different than how your PowerShell script reads, because you've had some flow control altering how things land. DSC is not guaranteed to be ordered. There is no order guaranteed in the resource that you define. There is a meta property that every DSC resource has called depends on, that you can use to, if you need something to run before your resource, before that particular resource, you have to explicitly say,
I need to make sure a folder exists before I put a file in it.
Yep, so you're going to say depends on file resource that creates the folder. So you're going to have these dependencies across, you can have dependencies across resources. Now, those dependencies will then create the order in which things could run, and then those things that aren't included in the dependencies can happen at any point in that process. Now, that is Puppet operates very similarly, though they're changing. Chef is ordered. So the order in which you declare stuff in a Chef recipe is the order in which it runs. The order of recipes that you specify, that's the order those are applied. So Chef is ordered by default. Puppet is going to ordered by default. DSC is not. It does right now. It does mostly right now because it's just single-threaded. But they're talking about doing, what they want to be able to do is some kind of intelligent multi-threading and like, oh, hey, creating this file and creating that file, they don't depend on each other at all. Let's just hit the file system in these two places, and we can do this at the same time, and then move on to the next thing and just be more, yeah. So they want to be able to do some more clever stuff. And CF Engine, I think they were influenced a lot by some of the stuff Mark Burgess did with CF Engine, and some of the thinking around that. It's a perfectly valid approach. I like ordered by default because it's the principle of least surprise. I declared this to first. I expect this to happen first, and and I'm down. So you end up actually with things like where's my? So I actually had in this sample config that I have here, I have all these depends on because I want to make sure that I have this configuration to compare to some chef recipes, and to make it operate in the same way, I've got to have this one depend on this to make sure that this runs after this. Because I could look for the W3 service before this, technically. DSC doesn't care.
Where this completely explodes is if one of those is a V5 resource like wait for. Because even though you may have it appends in the wait for, if wait for doesn't exist, and it's not dependent on anything else because that may be waiting for a cluster node, it's going to run first and then it explodes because it doesn't exist. So you can't say, I want you to wait for installing V5 because V5 doesn't exist, so therefore they can't find the thing, that just explodes in a huge hours of debugging.
Yeah, circular dependencies are not fun.
Puppet has a concept of packages to service the file. The package goes first, service goes second, file goes third. DSC, while it's not ordered, just like Puppet, does DSC have a similar concept?
Not this time.
Features should go first, services go second. They don't have that concept yet.
Right, and they may or may not. That's they're still figuring out what that is going to end up looking like. What the actual algorithm for determining what goes first, second, third, who knows? That's not something that they've announced for V5 yet either.
They would threatening to go random. They would threatening if you don't have the depends right, then it would be random between.
Well, yeah, that's a super big caveat. If you want a specific order, you need to explicitly say it. And that's yeah.
So this is so in Chef we don't have to say it depends on. It'll since it's already in order, it will do it in order, right?
Yep. So like here's our DSC resource, the equivalent Chef resource with one of our next releases where we have DSC resource implemented, basically ends up looking like this. Very similar. In this case, I'm using Chef to call DSC resources. There's also another syntax, DSC script, which is actually shipping right now. But the order in which these things are declared is the order in which they run. Yeah, so in this case, you don't see any depends on properties being set because these will never run until this runs. And if this blows up, it stops before it goes here.
Yeah, is that going to change if the PowerShell team decides to do, hey, we're going to screw everybody by doing randomization?
This will not. This syntax. So PowerShell v5 introduces the concept of invoke DSC resource, where you just turn the local configuration manager into an API that you can call on a per resource basis rather than giving it a full configuration. And so you basically set the refresh mode to disabled, and you can call it that way. And that's what this method is doing. So we're not actually creating a configuration to ship to the LCM. So what Chef does with DSC script, here we create a configuration behind the scenes. That could mess this up. So I would need my dependencies in this. And I don't think I have them, and I should probably put them. Thank you. This is for my demos for getting some work done here. I'll just remember to come back here. So in DSC script, what we do is behind the scenes we call the PowerShell configuration DSL. We generate MOF document, apply it. Same way you, and this works with V4. Our new DSC resource stuff will only work with V5 because we use that invoke DSC resource. Use that invoke DSC resource endpoint. And in that case, their order doesn't matter because we're just calling an API in order. So order, and you can have arguments as far as what's better to do, to have kind of, hey, we have this hierarchy of packages and services and files, or whichever the order was. It all comes down to what tool fits your expectations best and meets the needs of your team. And so I personally like controlling order. I'm kind of a control freak that way. I like knowing the order things are going to happen, so I tend to gravitate towards systems that do that. Or if I'm doing DSC configurations, I use depends on a lot because I expect them to happen that way. All right. Yeah, interactive prompts. This is a big one. If you use @PS bound parameters to pass along things, every DSC resource is called with -verbose and -debug, all the functions, the set target resource, get target resource, because it enables the debug and verbose streams. So if you use @PS bound parameters to pass along to a command underneath, like say set net firewall rule, ask me how I know this, things don't go so well for you, because when you pass -debug to a sim to a commandlet that uses the sim commandlets that have the XML file that defines them, the CD XML commands, -debug breaks into a inquire debugger. So it prompts, hey, do you want to continue? Hey, do you want to continue? DSC doesn't do interactive. So my first crack at a firewall rule, at a firewall resource, didn't work so good. And I was trying to figure out why. And eventually found out, oh, this @PS bound parameters is biting me. So I have to take -debug out of that. I have to take the debug key out of the PS bound parameters. Make that work well. One thing you should get familiar with if you're going to be writing DSC resources or working with desired state configuration is Pester. Who here has heard of Pester? Most people, awesome. If you're one of the folks that haven't, don't feel bad, but do go out and learn a little bit about it. It is a testing framework for PowerShell. There are several ways you can use it in the context of desired state configuration. The first and most common is to test your resources because they're just PowerShell modules. So we can test the logic that we develop and do stuff like where's my tests? Oh, I think I moved them. Yeah. Page 5. Where you can basically set up a list of expectations of how your commands are going to respond, and Pester allows you to mock out commands, like say get WMI object, so you're not actually affecting your system state. Because hey, I'm developing a page file resource. it'd be really nice if when I test the logic of how my command works, like if I wanted to, if I want to make sure that it's only going to change my page file when it's out of whack, that I don't actually have to change the state on my system all the time. I can just feed in the values that I want it to check against. Pester allows you to do that, and so I can provide my own response for Get-WMI object rather than, in this case, rather than having to actually call it and having to set my system up like, oh, I got to delete my page file. Just to test this thing. It allows you to test a lot faster, and it allows you to test consistently across multiple machines. But you can do fun stuff like, hey, when the automatic page file is not configured, how should it respond? Or how does Get-TargetResource respond? Is it actually going to call put to set the WMI values when I expect it to? And so you can write some tests, and then when the tests run, they kind of read out as a description of how the command's supposed to work. That's one way that you can use Pester. The other way is a little more kind of brute force. Say I have a configuration that calls Windows feature to install IIS. I can run a Pester test to reach out to port 80 and connect and make sure I'm getting the response I expect. And I can have a test that tests that I actually got to the end state that I expect to be in. That's another important part of this whole of the whole configuration management space is using some tool outside of our config management to verify that our config management did what we expect it to do. Because we spend time writing these scripts and things like that, and I would love to be able to trust DSC or Chef or Puppet or CF Engine to tell me that, hey, everything is okay. But I'm really kind of skeptical because I've had tools lie to me before. Because tools are software written by humans. And so having another tool outside of that config management validate that things got to where they should be is a good thing. So as you get into writing configurations, as you get into writing resources, get familiar and get comfortable with Pester. Microsoft and VMware have been helping out or have formed a working group around Pester to kind of make that the official testing framework for the PowerShell ecosystem. They're working with the core committers, like Dave Wyatt, on Pester itself, and we should start seeing some of the community stuff that Microsoft ships starting to ship with tests in Pester. Yeah. One of the things I told them, I will never use your X resources in production until you start shipping some tests. Because for me to go back and reverse engineer what you guys did in your resource so I can put tests around it so I can make changes safely, I might as well write my own resource.
So when you author your own custom resources, you start with writing tests first?
I eventually got there. I didn't start there, but I got there because I ended up spending so much time manually, interactively testing that the only way I could efficiently move forward was to start writing tests. And sometimes I write sometimes I actually do true test first, where I write the test first. Sometimes I get a little ahead of myself and then go back and plumb some tests in. The big point is at the end of the day, you have a starting place of coverage for what you expect to happen with your commands or with your resources. That when you get a bug report, you can go put a test in around that. It's you just have to do one test to kind of verify, hey, I took care of this. And then when you make further changes, you run your tests and make sure, hey, nothing broke. So I didn't break any of my expected functionality, or oh, this broke. I changed something wrong. I need to, or maybe my test is wrong now. And that's a perfectly valid thing to happen as well. So, but this might say, this concept might seem a lot more developerish. Well, the minute you start getting into the configuration management space, one of the common terms for infrastructure is code. There's a lot of developerish terms around the space. You don't have to be scared of them. Learn them. It's not that bad, and it actually makes you way more productive. Yes, you will spend a little more time up front with tests, but when you go back and look at, when I come back to edit that thing, how much manual testing I don't have to do later, or when I'm first trying to get this thing out, it ends up saving you so much on that back end. It is definitely worth the time and investment. And especially if you want to contribute to any open source projects. It's almost a requirement to get pull requests merged in many open source projects. And so having a comfort level just around the terminology and kind of how it works is a really beneficial thing. Even if you're not going to write any tests yourself, that you're able to know how Pester works so you can run tests others have provided and have that level of comfort. So when you go to change something, we all know we're going to change something at some point. Because requirements are going to change, APIs are going to change. We get the server 2020, and now guess what? App command doesn't work anymore. We got to go change things. So if there's a harness of tests that I can fall back against that validate the functionality, I'm going to be that much faster to adapt to those changes. Oh, there's. Test DSC Resource is a commandlet that is available, or a function that's available from the DSC Resource Designer. This is a huge help. It's not perfect, but it's a huge help, and we've made some improvements to it. We have a community version of this one as well. But it does a couple of things when you write a DSC resource. It'll validate the schema.moff for you that it's valid moff syntax. It validates that the parameters are consistent across your functions, and that the parameter sets that you have match what's in the schema.moff. So it verifies the moffs that's actually valid moff syntax, and it validates your parameters against it. This will catch a huge number of little mismatches as you make tweaks to DSC resources. And when you wonder why, hey, why won't my DSC resource? Why is it telling me it's not found? What's not working here? Test DSC resource is a huge, huge benefit to validating the state of a resource. So once you've got some custom resources, you need to be able to use them inside of a configuration. If your module is inside PS Home modules, you don't need to worry about import DSC resource. You just need to worry about your pattern of deploying modules. It's not a good practice to drop your stuff into C, Windows System 32, Windows PowerShell, V1 modules. That's for Microsoft to drop stuff into. However, that's the only magical place that DSC will find modules without import DSC resource. If your modules are outside of that, but they are on your PS module path that is available to the computer. So you have PS module path. PS module path has a user component and a system component, just like any other environmental variable. The computer component is the important one because the LCM runs as local system, or runs a system. So it doesn't have access to your user account and therefore your user path, because it doesn't know necessarily what user created the configuration or care. It doesn't really matter. So by default with PowerShell 4, we have this new location in program files, Windows PowerShell modules. That is by default where DSC resources, custom resources should go. You can add other locations to PS module path for the computer at the system level. Sort of. You can do it with PowerShell 5. You can do it with PowerShell 4 if you have patch. It's a November roll-up from it's like 850 it ends. But there's a November roll-up out there that fixes a bug. Because PowerShell v4 out of the box will only look in these two locations. It won't look in anywhere else in PS module path. But it's fixed in 5. It's fixed in that November roll-up. Or December roll-up, one of the two. Yeah. So those are the locations that's going to look. When you're testing them yourself, you can have them on your PS module path in your user profile, but that won't help when you try to apply a configuration. But we need to use, so import DSC resource, I mentioned, that's not a commandlet. We cannot go run get command for it and find it. It doesn't exist. It looks like a commandlet. It's confusing like that. But it's actually a keyword. Just like node, just like configuration. It's a new keyword that's valid in the context of a configuration document, nowhere else in PowerShell. It also cannot be inside of a node block. Right? So you'll have configuration, and you'll have import DSC resource. Then you'll have your node statements. And you can say a module name. You can also specify down to the resource. So like, say I have both the C web administration and the X web administration modules on my system. And maybe for whatever reason, they both have a website resource. I could have import DSC resource, module name, C web administration. I could take the app pool resource out of there, and maybe I take the website module, website resource out of the X web administration. So you can specify, you can have multiple import DSC resources. You can specify just the module name, which will make all the resources in that module available. Or you can specify individual resources to be loaded and available. If you don't do that, you'll get an error saying, hey, this resource doesn't exist. Then you'll go to the command line, and you'll run get DSC resource, and you'll see it. And you'll shake your fist at the computer and say, what is wrong? This is not what I expect. I see it with get DSC resource. You're missing the import DSC resource.
It's 28832.
That is.
Well, that's the big fix.
That's the GA fix. There's another roll-up that actually it updates the local configuration manager so it can deal with configurations generated on PowerShell 5. It adds a debug mode for version 4. It adds a couple other features, and it fixes a bunch of bugs.
That's post that one.
It's like 3,850. So yeah, 3,000,850. It's an optional update. It was an optional update earlier in the year. It might be required now, but it's only for Server 2012 R2 right now, and it's supposed to go down level as well. But it was just a general kind of optional update, like November, December timeframe. But it fixes a bunch of stuff in PowerShell 4 around DSC, and it adds a few nice things. So, and that update fixes this bug actually. So there's a bug in PowerShell 4 if you don't have that roll-up. If you're in a pull server environment, you can tell it, hey, get me the latest module whenever you need to. Whenever the configuration has a newer one, get me a new one. First time it'll work. Second time it'll work. Third time it tries, it will fail because what it didn't clean up after itself. What it would do is, say I have X Web Administration version 1. I now need X Web Administration 1.1. It'll rename X Web Administration .temp, pull down the new one, but it doesn't delete the .temp one. So then when it tries to download 1.2, it tries to rename X Web Administration .temp that exists. So it says, oh, can't do anything here. Sorry. I can't. But you'll get an error that it wasn't able to unzip the new module. And so the error is about the new module. It has nothing to do with the new module. It has to do with the fact that you have this .temp file in your, or this .temp folder in your program files Windows PowerShell modules. That bug is fixed with that patch. It's also fixed in version 5. So I was hoping to dive into, to actually go into and show you a little bit more detail on the class-based resources, but I think we're going to run out on time. There's something that's really important if you're able to deploy, or that might make it more easy for you to deploy PowerShell 5 in production now. Who's heard of stable designs and experimental features? One hand. All right. So the PowerShell team has been trying to be more agile and fast with releases for Windows Management Framework 5. They're delivering new versions of this every quarter. So about every 3 months, we're getting a new version of PowerShell 5. One of their challenges is, the big warning that you see on it is, hey, this is pre-release software, don't deploy in production because you're not going to get support. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what it says. But then they go around and kind of beg and say, can you please deploy this so that we can get some feedback on it? And well, you're telling me I can't deploy it, but you're telling me you want me to deploy it. If I deploy it, will I get support? No. Well, but can you deploy it? A little bit of a problem here. So, starting, I believe I forgot it was November. I think it's November preview. Yeah, I think it was November preview. They said we're going to have this concept of experimental designs and stable features. And what that's going to mean is that you can deploy WMF5 in production, call Microsoft support, and get support. And you will get support on anything that's you will not be voiding your support access just because WMF5 is on the system. And you can actually get support if you're having problems with issues that are marked stable designs. As of the February preview, class-based resources are a stable design. The DSC engine is a stable design. You can get support for Windows PowerShell 5 on production systems from Microsoft with the pre-release in production. Now, there's some experimental stuff that's in there, and so if you're trying one of those scenarios and it causes a problem, they're not going to be able to help you. But if it's a standard deployment of one of the stable designs, you can get support. So you won't be voiding your supportability by deploying WMF5 in production. And now they used to only release the Windows Management Framework pre-releases for the latest operating system. Now they've also gone back down a level, so you can get 2012 and 2012 R2 for PowerShell 5. And maybe we'll see 2008 R2 in the near future. Here's hoping. I got lots of customers in 2008 R2.
Are they likely to the X resources and things like that? Are they likely to support you?
No. X resources have X for a reason. They are demoware. Some of them might be really good. I don't touch them with a 10-foot pole if I can help it. Again, no tests, no support, no GitHub page with issues. I mean, even if they didn't have support, if there was an open source page that I could actually get pull requests merged back into. It's a lot of work to fork their resources as it stands, because you have to change the namespacing on everything. As they release new stuff, getting them merged, it's a pain. I'm trying to do it with some of the community resources. It's a headache. So I just stay away from them for the most part. It pains me to say that, because I know a lot of people, and a lot of smart people, put effort into making those things for people to use. But I have to say it, and I've said this to the PowerShell team, and I've told them this is what it hurts me to say this. But until they fix that, I have to say, for production systems, you're taking a risk with the X resources. That said, if you download a cookbook from Supermarket, you're taking the same risk, unless if there's no public project page for it, or if it's not a supported cookbook from Chef, you're taking a risk. It's open source software. There's no support statement. So, yes.
You mentioned the community resources versus the experimental ones. Where can people go if they want to contribute or
GitHub.
find the community resources?
GitHub, PowerShell.org has an organization on GitHub. It's linked to in several posts on PowerShell.org. Got Chrome up here somewhere. Yeah. So PowerShell.org, GitHub. Go GitHub.com, PowerShell.org. You'll find a bunch of, PS Tech Letter is not a DSC resource, but there's a bunch of repositories that have resources in them. If you want to help contribute to them, we'd love help. If you want to file issues, use them. Hey, anything, we definitely are. We definitely love a little bit of feedback. Yes.
On the script center, the repository, there's the things that says the PowerShell team, the way releases, is that different than?
Yes. Yes, it is. Yep. Some of these are forked from those, because there's no way for us to contribute back to those. There's nowhere for us to file issues on those. The PowerShell team has received that feedback loud and clear, and they are working on that scenario. But until that stuff materializes, I shy away from the X resources. All right. So stable designs, experimental features. I just want to show you here. In the release notes is where they detail this stuff. And you'll see there's new scenarios, and they'll have some old scenarios. And this is just one of the boxes where they show, but you'll see the design status for each of these things. So if you're going to use partial configurations with mixed refresh modes, no support. But you're going to be able to use a commandlet to remove DSC documents. If you ran into a problem with that, support. So you can deploy this stuff into production and still keep your support from Microsoft. That's a huge step forward for being able to get some production testing of these newer features and still have an opportunity to give feedback on them before they're part of an official release. The PowerShell team wants to keep doing this. They want to keep releasing fast. Even after WMF5 releases, they want to keep running these previews, getting new features out faster to you so that you can take advantage of them and they can help you in your environments. And so, they may be refining the design status thing over time, but this concept seems like, according to the PowerShell team, is here to stay. That we will continue to get previews. We will continue to get new features faster than the standard releases, and in a way that we can get them into production. So that, for me, is awesome. Yes?
Is it expected that they are going to have somewhere that's not just in the release notes, so that way you don't have to go back through the last 5 release notes cycles to figure out, hey, well, this was stable, and yeah, it turned stable 6 months ago.
So they have new scenarios here, and then they'll have they've got a section old scenarios. So it's kind of a roll up in each of the. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in the release notes. Let's see. So scenarios enabled by a previous release of WMF5, and it updates. So the archive commandlets, those are all stable. Network switch management, stable. ISC stuff for improved ISC functionality for DSC. 32-bit support for DSC. Yeah. Okay. So I've been told I talk too much, which is probably true. And so class-based resources, we don't have Get-TargetResource, Set-TargetResource, Test-TargetResource anymore. We have Set, Test, and Get serve the same purpose. The nice thing about this, no nested modules, so no DSC resources folder that just sit right in your module, and no schema.mof files when you do a class-based resource. So supposedly it's a little easier to write. I'm kind of ambivalent on it. I like that we can do it. I don't necessarily know it's easier, or I don't necessarily believe it's easier because we had tooling, and tooling makes things easier. One of the things, if you do include class-based modules or class-based resources in your module, there's a new key in PowerShell 5 to module metadata. It's DSC resources to export, like commandlets to export, functions to export. There's a DSC resources to export, and you list your DSC resources in there, and then get DSC resource can find them. Some places to go for further reading help: PowerShell.org, blog posts, which are kind of old on DSC. The forums are still relatively active. We've got the GitHub repository. There's a DSC ebook. PowerShell team blog has a bunch of good stuff on all the new features. A lot of cool stuff in debugging have come out in Windows Management Framework 5, like remote debugging, like alternate process debugging. Some really interesting stuff to help make your DSC debugging easier. Jacob Benson did a pretty good blog series. PowerShell Magazine has got a bunch of good stuff as well. But that's all we got for slides. So with that, I think I've run about out of time. Thank you guys very much for your attention, and especially for all your questions. I love talking about this stuff, and have had an awesome time. Thank you guys very much for your hospitality.